Hey people, welcome to Accidental Gods, to the podcast where we believe that another world is still possible, and that if we all work together, there is still time to lay the foundations for that future that we would be proud to leave to the generations that come after us. I'm Amanda Scott, your host and fellow traveller on this journey into possibility, and this is our third election special. So for those of you who are not involved in the UK's general election, thank you for downloading, thank you for listening this far. Unless you're particularly interested in party politics, this is possibly not for you. Although, if you've read any Human Power, I think it'll be interesting to contrast what's possible within the book with what's actually happening on the ground. For those of you who are in the UK, and please, if you're in the UK or have access to a vote, please listen, because it does matter that we do whatever we can in this election. Our guest this time is Jeremy Gilbert, who is Professor of Culture and Political Theory at the University of East London. He's the author of many papers and books, including 21st Century Socialism and Hegemony Now, How Wall Street and Big Tech Won the World, and How We Can Win It Back, which was written with Alex Wiliams. Jeremy's a friend of the podcast. He was with us back in episode 95, and he's always my go-to person for insight into progressive thinking within and around the current Labour movement, and for a broader, more politically scientific view of where we're at and where we could be. I listen to a lot of Jeremy's other podcasts. As chance would have it, the Labour Party published their manifesto about 36 hours before we were due to record. So I took the chance to ask Jeremy what he thought of it. What's good? What could be better? And particularly, what can we who care about people and planet do to help shift us all onto a trajectory where we're not barreling towards the edge of the biophysical cliff? This is possibly not the most upbeat of conversations, because the answers to all three of these are not a lot, but joining a union is probably one of the more useful things you can do. But even beyond that, it gave us a chance to look into a bit of the ideological, conceptual and pragmatic views of the current Labour Party, and how we, who are watching its likely win with trepidation, can shape things towards a world that will work. I have linked in the show notes to Jeremy's website and books, and to where he is on Twitter, also to the Unite community membership that you can join, and to all three of the useful party manifestos, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and the Labour Party. And frankly, I am hoping for wins in that order, which is probably not going to happen, but we can see. So here we go. People of the podcast, for this election special, please welcome Professor Jeremy Gilbert. Jeremy, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. Welcome back, actually. Friend of the podcast. That's always a good thing.
Thanks, Alan.
How are you and where are you this lovely Friday morning?
I'm fine, thanks. I'm in Walthamstow in northeast London, right next door to Faisal Shaheen's constituency in Chingford.
Right.
So near one of the centres of the action in terms of the internal and external politics of the Labour Party.
Excellent. Okay, so we may get to that. But by pure chance, because we booked this a couple of weeks ago when we first heard the election was going to happen, we now have a Labour manifesto, which we can then quietly, or perhaps not so quietly, pick apart. And it's certainly not the same as the 2017 or 2019 elections. They're obviously endeavouring to prove to the people that they care about that they are very different to who they were. Not so different, I would say, to the party they're endeavouring to replace. But let's have your take on the manifesto. What's good about it? What's not so good? What do you think is changeable between now and the next time they produce a manifesto?
Well, what is good is there is still commitment to a number of policies which certainly New Labour were never willing to consider implementing, and which even Ed Miliband's manifesto in 2015 ultimately didn't really express any clear commitment to. So they do say they are going to take rail back into public ownership, although it's not going to be a grand renationalisation. It's going to be piecemeal as the private rail company contracts run out. So that's quite significant. They are going to build a publicly owned renewable energy generation company, which I'm not sure how that's going to work with the existing renewable energy generation companies. But again, that is a commitment to a form of public ownership, which throughout their period in office, New Labour weren't willing to make. There's also some commitment to renewed trade union rights, which, although it's much less than was promised a couple of years ago and less than the unions want, it's really more than ever happened under Blair. I mean, the furthest we got under Blair towards any sort of reversal of Thatcher's trade union reforms it wasn't really a reform of labour legislation. It was the introduction of the minimum wage. So there are definitely elements of the programme they're putting forward which are, I would say, progressive. They are certainly very different from anything the Conservatives are willing to do. If you might have expected, given the rhetoric that was informing Boris Johnson's campaign 5 years ago, you might have thought some of these might have been things that the Tories, if they had chosen ultimately to go in a very different direction to the one they've been going in for the past few decades, as some commentators thought they would. If they had done that, these are some of the things they might have done. But given that, especially under both Truss and Sunak, the Tories just sort of seem to have shrugged and just abandoned that idea and sort of gone back to a kind of manic pursuit of a low tax, low regulation, pro-finance capital agenda. Then from that point of view, these are all things the Tories wouldn't come near to contemplating anytime soon.
Yes.
So there is, I think, a fairly significant difference, although that is partly because, especially under Sunak, really, the political centre of gravity has moved so far to the right now that you don't have to be making any very dramatic sort of proposals to be to the left of that and to be looking more progressive than that.
Yes. But there's a scale of progress that seems to me... So let's unpick it a little bit. Their statements, particularly the Great British Energy, when I heard that, I thought it sounded like a really good idea. But then I look at the actual manifesto, and to drive forward investment, blah, 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 Labour will create a new publicly owned company owned by the British people and deliver power back to the British people, which all sounds really good. But it will do this by co-investing in leading technologies, help support capital-intensive projects and deploy local energy production to benefit communities across the country, and they're going to give it $8.3 billion over the next Parliament. But it sounds... it's not actually going to generate any power. It looks like a shell company for hedge funds.
Yeah.
If you unpick what it's actually saying it's going to do as opposed to what you're meant to read it. It strikes me that whoever's written this is very well practiced at producing stuff that sounds like it ticks all the boxes that you want, but actually, when you unpick it and look at what it says, a Cameronian government could have done the same. We're going to invest in people who want to invest in clean energy, and we're going to smooth the way, and we might change regulation. There's nothing about changing regulation, as far as I can tell, for onshore wind or...
No.
creating it, making it any easier for people to use solar panels. And there's no suggestion of where the materials come for this or how it fits into a low carbon economy. There's a bit further down in the manifesto about building 300,000 homes. And my key question for that is, how are you going to do that net zero? Or do you just not care anymore about where our carbon is going? And I know the meta crisis is not all about the carbon. That's a given, and that's something else that they don't seem to get. But there's no suggestion that there's any joined up thinking around the fact that we are hitting planetary boundaries faster than we ever have. Have you any insight into, first of all, what the new energy companies are actually going to do?
No.
And second, what the thinking is behind it, other than making a lot of nice noises for people who are currently finding it hard to heat their houses?
Well, no, I think they don't really know what they're going to do with it beyond this stuff. I mean, you could interpret what they've actually written in the manifesto as this will be a shell company for hedge funds, an investment vehicle. you could instead interpret it as being this will be the sort of very strategic, industrial policy that people like Tony Benn were trying to develop in the 1970s. So it could be anything, really. Could be any of those things. And I think that's fairly typical of a lot of what's in the manifesto, that it's just, they're just not really committing themselves one way or another on which of those things it could be. So it's a lot, it's a lot easier to interpret this as developing some new kind of industrial policy than anything that would have been in Labour's sort of 2005 or 2010 manifestos, for example.
Okay. Yes. Fair enough.
But it could also not be, and we just don't know. And that and I think a lot of people would assume that they don't really know, that they're leaving things open. They're going to see what the lay of the land is politically and economically in a few months' time, in particular. And probably they're going to try and keep putting it off for a year or so, really, before they have to really decide what sort of a direction they're going to go in. And I think we won't really know what they're going to do until the time comes when they have to do it.
Until they actually have to do something. Yeah. And they could spin their wheels for an entire parliament if they felt like it, in which case I think we are looking at Nigel Farage as our next prime minister, come 5 years from now, because spinning wheels is not going to cut it with people anymore. One of the things that really scared me watching Twitter yesterday was people showing bar graphs, which of course you can use the statistics to prove anything, but previous Labour spending, current projected Labour spending, particularly on things like councils and schools. Around here, all the secondary schools are around about 500,000 in debt.
Yeah.
The council is about to shut our local recycling centre, which has always got a queue going into it whenever I go there. And then the nearest one is an hour's drive away.
Yeah.
Each way. And it's bonkers. On any joined up thinking, either we're going to end up with a countryside that is also full of rubbish in the way our rivers currently are, or individual people are going to be driving 2 hours in presumably internal combustion engines, because that's what we still mostly have, to take their recycling to a recycling centre they can no longer easily access. The focus on keeping a small commentariat who still don't understand the way money works happy seems to me to be what's driving this. Either it's keeping the commentariat, the Kunzberg and Peston and the others who still seem to think that you have to balance the books when the government spends money into existence. And if it doesn't, the banks have to lend more money into existence to keep the economy growing, because the banks have to suck out their now 5% or 10% or whatever percent they choose to levy. And listening to people like Steve Keen, we are now way over the level of personal private debt to public debt that kicked off the 08-09 recession. And I wonder, and this is something I wanted to ask you, if Sunak jumped when he did, because they have credible reason to believe that there is a really big crash coming and they want it to be on Labour's watch so they can yet again say this is Labour's fault when quite clearly it isn't. But people will run with that narrative regardless of any facts attached to it.
Well, I don't know, but that's perfectly plausible, because the calling of the election at the time when it was called is quite mysterious.
Although people were betting on it a month in advance, which does tell you something. It wasn't. He didn't just throw a tantrum and walk out into the rain, which is what I had thought. He had at least a month before that, his aides were betting on the 4th of July as the election date, which is beyond stupid, but also quite telling.
Yeah. Well, we've already seen the economic statistics showing that there was no growth in April, which basically means we're probably heading back into recession. It could just as well be that they knew that was coming as they think that there's some huge 2008-style crisis around the corner. It could just be that they were confident that there wasn't going to be any significant improvement in the economic outlook in the next 6 months, because they only had 6 months left in which to call an election or have one thrust upon them.
Yes.
So I don't think we can infer from that they're necessarily expecting a huge crisis.
Does Labour understand? It seems to me, I only did a master's in economics. It was a year. It wasn't big stuff, and I don't pretend to be an economist, but the wheels of the economy have to be oiled from somewhere. And if it isn't government spending, it's people taking out private debt. We're in a state now where the fossil fuel companies are price gouging everyone for everything they can get, which is driving inflation. Food prices are are stupid at the moment. And I live in a small holding. Nothing is growing. And I don't think Sunak is going to notice that, but we're going to be in serious homegrown food shortages this winter, I think. For animal feed and human feed, it's actually just not coming up out of the ground in the way. This time last year, our polytunnel horticulture area was alive, and it looks like a desert at the moment. The beans are not even in flower. And I don't think the people who run the parties are aware of things on the ground, but what is going to happen when nobody can afford to feed themselves? They're not going to take out more private debt. So if the government cuts its, has to keep within these bizarre fiscal boundaries, I don't see how the economy keeps on its feet.
No, well, I don't think anybody really expects they are going to necessarily keep within those boundaries, to be honest.
Okay.
I think it's fairly clear. There's a fairly consistent position from most economic commentators, even ones who are, well to the right politically of anyone like myself or anyone I would normally listen to and talk to, that the situation just isn't sustainable, that the general deterioration of the social fabric that you're talking about, that we've seen over the past, to some extent, the past 14 years of austerity, but also the past 40 years, really, just isn't sustainable without passing some really dramatic tipping points.
Right.
And under those circumstances, they're going to have to borrow, or they're going to have to raise taxes. I would say this is a point that's been made by a few people, but I think the slogan they keep using is "we will not raise taxes on working people," and that's a very elastic phrase. So,
okay.
That's being interpreted as saying they will never raise income tax or national insurance. I think they could well decide to say later, well, that we meant we wouldn't raise it on most people. We wouldn't raise.
Okay. Or they could have a capital gains tax on the city. 0.1% on every transaction would not bleed the banks and would raise a lot of money.
Yeah, they can definitely do all that. And I think, part of the problem for people like us right now is if they were planning to do something like that, they wouldn't tell us.
Okay.
Like they wouldn't tell anyone because they wouldn't want the city to know about it or the right-wing press to know about it. But they also, and this speaks a bit to themes we talked about last time I was on the show, they don't want people like you and me like getting enthusiastic and like rejoining the Labour Party. Like they got really
no risk of that.
They really got burned. They're what they learned from the experience of Corbynism is it's very, very dangerous for their jobs and their positions to have an enthusiastic like mass membership party like that wants to see radical reform and expects them to deliver it. They really, really don't want that. The party bureaucracy, they really don't want that. Even if they are planning to deliver radical reform, they don't want a bunch of lefties like getting all excited and joining the party because they'll just start electing people other than them to the National Executive Committees.
Quite. And then they won't be able to give themselves safe seats so that they can get into Parliament like they've always wanted.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't be telling us about it even if they were planning to do that.
Okay.
But my assumption would be, I just don't think nothing I know about history, recent or long term, would suggest that we're living in the kind of world where, people like Starmer and Rachel Reeves like have secret plans to actually, implement radical reforms.
No.
And then go on to do it. I would say they're probably, planning out several different possible scenarios. I think they can't be dumb enough not to think there's going to be a big crisis. I think they might be hoping they might avoid one.
Okay. Right. The kind of Wile E. Coyote, if we run fast enough, we'll get across this canyon and we won't have to look down. Well,
of course, the historical experience, which is really important to a lot of these people, is the experience of the Blair government. And the Blair government never really had to deal with any of these sorts of issues because they found themselves entirely by accident, really, entirely by luck, riding the wave of a massive economic boom, which was generated by the big technological revolution coming out of the States, was generated by the internet boom.
And also the fossil fuel boom. We've burned more oil since 1995 than the whole of the rest of human history. I think the fact that oil was cheap and available, and both of these are no longer the case. So they can't believe that they're going to see all this again, can they?
No, that's true. Well, I'm sure they probably know, they must know it's unlikely, but I would imagine they're really hoping that it will turn out that, Chat GPT is the new internet, and
yes,
and that there's some step change in green energy production just around the corner.
So we can maintain the system as it is. We're just going to have a different source of energy. They truly don't get that this is not about the carbon, do they?
No, I don't think they do. No,
they haven't understood that the oceans will die regardless of what we do with the carbon if we continue with the microplastics and the industrial agricultural effluent, for instance.
Yeah, of course. So I think they probably are hoping. They're probably hoping, and they probably will try and drag it out for a year or so to see if, just in case something turns up, frankly.
Jeremy, what do you think is driving them? I could not have a lower opinion of the people who, from the NEC, have just given themselves allegedly safe seats, and my hope that the safe seats turn out not to be safe is very high, but probably unfounded. I'd like to get to Faiza Shaheen at some point, and Jeremy, obviously. But in the meantime, they look to me like apparatchiks, they look to me like suits, they look to me like people for whom the phrase wisdom to power and power to wisdom does not apply. Wisdom, pretty low. Emotional literacy, pretty low. Capacity for understanding complexity, non-existent. What is driving them beyond wanting to get a seat and call themselves the Honourable or the Right Honourable?
Nothing. Nothing is driving them beyond that.
This is not encouraging, is it? Because that's what drove Johnson. He didn't want anything other than to be Prime Minister. He didn't know what he wanted to do when he got there.
No. Well, I would assume that really the answers to most of the big questions you've been asking today are ultimately not going to be supplied by these people. They'll be supplied by the civil service. Historically, when you get a bunch of people in government who just want to be in government and don't really have any sort of an ideological program, then you just let the civil servants do everything. You just let the civil service decide how to run the country. And you haven't got Tufton Street running an ideological crusade like we had with Truss and to a lesser extent Sunak, and so nobody's stopping the civil service from being competent. No, I think that's right. And it's not an accident that Starmer's chief of staff, Sue Gray, comes from the civil service and is very close to the civil service. I'm sure to some extent the reason she was put in that position is because on some level they sort of know that the political team around Starmer, what they knew how to do and what they have done was defeat the left bureaucratically inside the Labour Party and take complete control of the parliamentary party. And also to shift the party sufficiently to the right that they could win, the necessary tens of thousands of Tory to Labour swing voters.
And they could win the media, I would say.
Yes, win the media as well.
I mean, they've won the Mail and the Telegraph and the Times and the Sun, and I'm not certain that was a huge achievement. If it's a huge achievement if what you're planning to do is then do something progressive. If all you're doing is persuading the editors that you're not their enemy, then I remember years before Blair got in, there was a story where he went to the CBI and whoever was leading the Tories at that point, I can't remember who it was, gave their speech, and Blair stood up and put his hands in his pockets and said, well, I left my notes at home, and everybody thought, oh God, this is going to be a car crash. And then he said, we'd say exactly what they said, only we'd tell you they were saying something different, so you don't really need to listen to me for half an hour. And thereby won the CBI. And it seems to me that the people around Starmer have basically done exactly that to the editors that they care about, whose opinions matter in the legacy media. First of all, is that true? And second, how do we get around that? Because I don't know about you, but I think we're heading close to biophysical limits that did not apply in Blair's time. And it's not all about the carbon. It's about the system. And if they are genuinely hoping that some generalized AI is going to supercharge extractivism and the death cult of predatory capitalism to the point where they can sail to our mutual deaths on some kind of economic boom, then we're finished, basically.
Yeah, well, I think it is true. I think what you said is true, that they're absolutely focused on detoxifying themselves in the eyes of the press in just the same way that Blair and his people were. And that has been a major driving factor of what they've been doing so far. And I think you're also right that, it's very unlikely to work. They're very likely to find themselves facing like a major social crisis within the next couple of years. I think sooner or later, the frustration of young people They're really being offered nothing. They're not being offered a future by this package, and they're not being offered jobs. They're not being offered rent they can afford. They're not being offered lives, really. That frustration is...
Yeah. I just wrote the novel all about what happens when that crashes.
So I think that they are going to find themselves facing quite a dramatic crisis. And my strong suspicion is like how they respond to that is just ultimately going to depend on who they're more scared of at that moment. Because if they're sufficiently scared of the organised masses, then quite likely they will have to do something fairly radical. Yeah, they have it within the kind of institutional memory of their own political tradition. The Great Reforming Government of 1945, they were part of that as much as the left was. So they could just turn around and do that. They could just, say, okay, this is what we have to do now. But they could also do, they could do much less palatable things. They could look to the example of Thatcher in the early 80s, effectively militarising the police and sending it into discipline communities like black people in the cities, trade unionists, hippies, young people, students getting ridden down by mounted police in 1985 on Westminster Bridge. It could well be
Great.
That could well be where we're heading as well. I think they'd obviously have to maintain the electoral coalition they've put together for themselves now, which is quite dependent upon, it's very dependent upon homeowners as much as anything else.
Right. Older people, therefore, because very few young people can afford to. So they're basically taking over what the Tories took over, which is if you get a chance to go and speak to an old people's home or a school, you go to the old people's home because they're going to vote for you.
So, yeah, they definitely are going to face significant crises. But I think what the outcome will be is going to depend on whether, it will partly depend on whether the broad coalition of progressive forces, including environmentalists, trade unionists, community groups, NGOs, etc., is able to put enough pressure on them, is able to scare them enough, to be honest.
How do we do that? What would work? Because telling them that we don't like them isn't working.
Well, no, I think it'll involve a number of things. Obviously, the key force there is the trade unions, because the trade unions are the one organisation within that potential coalition that retains a very high degree of bureaucratic leverage over them, even at the party level.
Some of them, though, because there are some of the unions that are further to the right even than the existing Labour Party, as far as I can tell, without naming names and getting ourselves into lawsuits, because they seem to be quite capable of throwing lawsuits around. There are some really nasty people running some of the unions at the moment. Yeah,
there are, yeah. But those people could be got rid of under specific historic circumstances. They probably won't be, but I would say, just in terms of the unions that are affiliated to the Labour Party, you don't have to win the leadership of the GMB to significantly change the balance of forces. You would have to get rid of the current, or push in a different direction, the current leadership of Unison.
Yep.
The right only won the leadership of Unison by a very small margin a couple of years ago. And Unison are going to really, really struggle to control and discipline their own membership, given that their core membership is poorly paid public sector workers. So,
right, yeah.
Under those circumstances, under circumstances in which their own rank and file are becoming increasingly militant, there'll be significant pressure on the Unison leadership to stop simply rubber stamping everything the Starmerites want to do within the Labour Party. And that will significantly weaken their position, even at within the bureaucratic structures of the party. And there is such a thing as peer pressure, even between senior trade unionists. So I think you have to see the unions as really key. Okay. And to some extent, I think from that point of view, the way in which everybody else within that potential progressive coalition relates to the trade unions is going to be quite important.
Okay.
I think I might have said this last time I was on the show. I'm often saying this when I'm talking to people in a sort of, green and community politics audience, is that the thing you have to remember when trying to get trade unions to do something is that you have to be very deferential to them. You have to be very nice to them, because your typical full-time trade union official lives in a kind of world in which they are firmly convinced that no one in any other kind of organisation or campaign has ever really had to struggle or has ever won anything. They have some reason. I mean, they're not totally wrong,
right,
to a certain extent. I mean, these people belong to organisations that have histories going back to Victorian times.
Yeah, and they got us the weekend, and they got us gender rights, and they got us minimum pay, and all of those things. So they do have a history of success that we on the green left don't.
Yeah, exactly. So if environmentalists just get very moralistic about them, if you just get very moralising at them about things like, not wanting to see, fossil fuel plants shut down without a very clear programs for transitioning into other jobs straight away, then they are just going to kick back. They're not going to support a broad program. They're not going to. Why should they?
Okay, but if we could show them there are really good jobs that are going to be well paid and high skilled, and we will help train, is that a reasonable offer?
Well, I think, to be fair, they know that.
Okay.
I mean, I think, for example, Unite's objection to the Labour manifesto they've been very explicit. Their objection hasn't been that they said they weren't going to renew oil and gas licenses. It was that they didn't say there would definitely be these jobs created for those people straight away.
Right.
And I think that has to be part of the package, part of the programme has to be that. And I'm afraid it is, it's very consistent with a sort of culture of a lot of green activism in this country that, well, you can't possibly say that, because if you're saying that, you just don't understand how desperately important it is that we shut down that power station right now. So You're just not understanding the nature of the situation if you're saying that we'll only shut down that power station if we have a plan for new jobs to replace it in a green technology down straight away. And I think people really do have to shake off that sort of moralism. And understand who it is they're talking to, because ultimately, I think we will need the trade unions to effectively lead that coalition, that push against the government if they're going in a rightward direction. And I think, we do need to be sort of morally pressuring them to do that, but we need to be pressuring them to exercise leadership rather than expecting them to follow the leadership of community activists from Totnes.
Or even from Shropshire. Okay. All right. That makes sense.
Yeah. So I think that will be really important. I mean, this is me refraining. I probably said this last time I was on the show. This is a refrain of something I was saying to people in the early stages of XR. I was saying, look, what you want to be doing is you do want to be demonstrating outside the offices of the trade unions. You want to be doing that, and you want to be saying to them, we call on you to exercise the leadership that only you can exercise.
Right.
So we recognise we both defer to you, but we also have expectations of you from that position of deference. And I think that is what we are all going to have to be saying to the trade union leaderships, really. We're going to have to be saying that we will defer to them, but we expect them to show leadership in return for that deference to some extent, and that we need them to do that. We need them to be leading the transition to a green economy.
So one thing that people listening could do usefully would be to join a union. And even I discovered that as a self-employed writer, I could still join a union.
Yes.
And it gives me a vote in ways that, I can't vote in the Labour Party because no longer a member, but I can vote in a union.
Yes, you should join a union, and almost anyone who isn't in a union can join, for example, Unite Community, which is just...
That's exactly what I joined.
Yeah, which is specifically set up to be a subsection of Unite, which represents people who aren't in otherwise unionised fields or occupations. So, it is, I would say everybody should join a union. And as we've said, you'll almost certainly be able to join Unite Community if you can't join any other union. And
it's pretty open.
And Unite Community does matter. I mean, Unite Community branches, they end up having a say over what goes on in local Labour parties, for example, and over candidates' elections and things. So it does really matter. Well,
up to a point, until the NAC decides to just impose themselves.
Exactly.
Talking about that, can we shift to that for a bit? Because I'm really curious. You're right next to Faiza Shaheen in Chingford, and then there's Jeremy standing as an independent in Islington North, and then Andrew Feinstein standing against Keir. I would be so happy if he won. I'm assuming he won't. Faiza and Jeremy, do you think they are looking like they could win?
Well, first, let me give the usual disclaimer that I am still a member of the Labour Party. Therefore, officially, publicly, I can only say that everybody should always vote for the official Labour candidate in every election. I can say, as an academic observer of politics, that I can fully understand why anybody who wasn't a committed member of the Labour Party might decide to make a different decision if they wanted to push British politics in a progressive direction. So having made that disclaimer...
Well done.
Well, there aren't any
you.
polls. I mean, people have been trying to raise money to commission local polls, so it's all guesswork, basically.
Are the Labour Party not even commissioning polls, or if they are, they're not telling us the results?
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think they are, actually.
They don't want to know.
It's a lot of money.
Right.
It's about £7,000, I think, to commission a constituency poll.
Right.
So I would be very surprised, as most people would, if Jeremy Corbyn didn't win his seat. I keep hearing people say, oh, they're not sure, they're not convinced on the ground.
Yes, but they'll say that, won't they?
They will say that.
To keep the bar as low as they can.
And also, my sense is that people in Jeremy's own constituency who are campaigning for him are a bit worried about complacency. They're worried that in the end the turnout might be low and produce a really unpredictable result because people just assume he's going to win. But I'm not sure.
Right. I've seen some online events to raise money for him that looked like they were crammed. This is the thing about Jeremy. I watch things with Stormer and he just looks plastic, and there are 6 people who've obviously been paid to be there. And anything with Jeremy has hundreds. And if the press treated Jeremy the way they had treated Farage, who again does not actually get that many people crowding around him, I think the world would be a different place. But it does seem as if there's a degree of enthusiasm that I'm not seeing for other politicians, except possibly Pfizer. Yeah,
that's true. And there is a lot of enthusiasm for Pfizer locally, but the situation in Chingford is so unstable. Really nobody knows what's going to happen there. Ian Duncan Smith still held on to the seat in 2019, even though the Labour vote had gone up. It's an area that's demographically been changing really drastically over the past few years as working families who can't afford to stay in London are moving out there to get places to live.
Right.
So the demographics have really shifted in Labour's favour and even in Pfizer's favour, potentially.
Well, that's the thing, is if you actually wanted a progressive person, you'd go for Pfizer. I don't even know the name of the guy who's standing for Labour, but presumably there are still people who will, as a reflex, hit Labour as their box. Does that still a thing? I thought that kind of died with Johnson. I
think so. I think there is, yeah. It's a woman, it's Sharma Tatler, who's running for the seat as the official Labour candidate. Yes, I think there are people with very little general political information who still vote, who will just try to vote against the Tories. Also, I have to say, I don't live there, and everyone I know who lives there is supporting Pfizer, but they would do.
Yeah, that's because your bubble is your bubble. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the rest of the constituency.
That's right. And I think in particular, I mean, the reason Pfizer might not win is because there might be a big residual Tory vote. There might be there's residual Tory personal vote for Ian Duncan Smith. He's still quite a popular figure with a certain kind of very traditional Tory.
Wow. Have the boundaries changed significantly to support that? Have they moved them around so that they can sugar in more possible Tory voters?
No, the boundary changes haven't affected us around here very much. It was anticipated they might a few years ago, but I'm not sure they've really changed at all. Okay. And so there's that. There's also the possibility of a kind of right-wing, of a kind of Tory to Labour right-wing vote amongst people who wouldn't vote for Pfizer.
Okay, vote Labour to keep Pfizer out.
Yeah, they might do.
But then they also might vote Reform, which I listened to a Reform candidate at a hustings the other night, and it was an extraordinarily unpleasant experience.
Yeah.
But guaranteed to be popular with a certain level of people who need to hear what they will. There's a kind of know what they like and like what they know, and he'd obviously been very well trained to say exactly that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and that traditional white Tory constituency, which Chingford historically became famous for in the 1980s and 90s, when it was Norman Tebbett's constituency.
Yes, semi-house trained polecat.
Yeah, a lot of those people will probably vote for Reform, especially now that Farage is the leader. So, yeah, I think it's completely unpredictable in Chingford, actually. I've really got no idea what's going to happen.
Okay, we need to stop soon, but I would like to look a little bit about the potential for constitutional reform of any sort. Because they're talking about potentially giving the vote to 16-year-olds. I think that potential gives them a lot of space to not bother if they think the 16-year-olds are not going to vote for them, which why would they at the moment? But other than that, it seems to me we have famously Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and the technology of gods, and that's what's going to destroy us. And our medieval institutions, it seems to me, are manifestly unfit for purpose in the 21st century. And it isn't hard to imagine how to upgrade them. It's all in the novel. There's a blueprint in there, and it doesn't take a huge amount. You get rid of the House of Lords instantly and replace it with a rolling citizens' assembly. You set up a constitutional convention. I'm talking later today to Glenn Vile, who invented quadratic voting, which still leaves me a little bit dizzy, the fact that somebody did invent quadratic voting. But we have the technology now to really assess how people think. Audrey Tang has created social media that helps bring people together and helps them to bridge divides. We have technology now to make distributed democracy actually work. And we have a House of Commons where people sit just over 2 sword lengths apart so they can scream at each other, and it's an embarrassment every single time the cameras turn on. And the system seems to me designed to pick the kind of people who can survive that. And they're not, I have a friend who's standing, and I worry greatly that if she is elected, how is she going to survive that? When Barry Black left, because basically it was so toxic she didn't want to stay anymore, what does that say about the people who stay? Have we got any reason to believe that Labour would do a sensible thing? Because it seems to me if they brought in PR, the Tories and Reform would not be forming a government in the immediate future, and that would be a very wise thing to do. But that wisdom not in abundance in this lot. Are we seeing any signs of any kind of constitutional change, or are they just all waiting for their seats in the House of Lords and want to keep it as it is?
I'm afraid we're not really seeing much sign of that. The particular political current who currently control the Labour Party have historically not been interested in constitutional reform at all, really. So even though the Labour Party conference did vote for proportional representation for the first time in its history a couple of years ago.
Yeah, but they don't care, do they?
Yeah, even though the trade unions, several of the key trade unions are now officially in favour of PR. There's nothing about it in the manifesto. They said there wasn't going to be. Of course, no party is going to introduce proportional representation when they've got a 200-seat majority in the House of Commons. My own assessment of that is that the most likely circumstance under which we'll get significant constitutional reform is if the government does find themselves to be under really significant pressure from progressive forces. And at that moment, it seems like the cheapest concession they could make is some significant constitutional reform. So, again, I would say if we want that, which we should want it, then the key is to try to make it part of the list of demands that broad progressive forces are going to be trying to make to the government, especially the unions. So we do have this situation where the unions, especially Unite, but also Unison, now have positions that they are officially politically for PR, and Labour Party conference voted for it. And they are going to be pushing for all kinds of things, for much higher levels of public spending, public investment, higher public sector wages. And if we could make PR one of the things on their list, then we might find ourselves in a circumstance in which the government feels forced to offer it as a concession at a moment when they don't feel able to offer most of those other things. So I think keeping it on the agenda, keeping it up on the political agenda, and trying to avoid a situation where it's on the agenda of Green Party activists and Guardian readers
and Lib Dems, and some Labour. I was talking to Neil Lawson of Compass a couple of weeks ago, and it does sound as if there are a few, but they have to be very, very quiet because otherwise they were going to be replaced summarily in the way that Pfizer was.
Yes, yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, that is true. There are some MPs in favour. So, I mean, some parliamentary candidates of the Labour Party who will be in favour or have been. I mean, historically, that it wouldn't be the first time if all of the Labour MPs who told us before the election they were in favour of PR turned out not to be anymore.
Oh, okay.
Once they get elected. So,
because you like the system that got you to a place that you like being. If they saw reform coming up on the far right, and it looked like it stood a reasonable chance, which wouldn't surprise me, or a Conservative Party that was led by Farage and effectively was reform, would they do it as a kind of, guys, we need to keep this out of power and this is a way to do this? Or are they just not, do they not have that level of forward vision?
Well, they might do. But I think we're more likely to find ourselves in a circumstance in which they'll be arguing that it's first past the post that keeps reform out of power. I mean, reform are really going to struggle to actually win seats.
Right.
You know, they're going to have the vote. They're going to have a quite significant vote nationally.
Until they don't struggle.
Sure.
You know, the guy that I saw at the hustings, he said, I'm not going to win this time, but we'll win next time. And yes, of course, he might have to think that, but it also struck me as not impossible and actually quite terrifying.
It's not impossible, that's true. But I mean, I think the question we're more likely to be faced with is: do we want to work with reform in some sort of a very broad coalition to bring about PR? And I know that, and constitutional reform, and I know that a lot of people on the left are kind of absolutely horrified and think that you wouldn't do that, even if to get PR. I have to say, my own view is I would do that to get PR, because I think it's demonstrable. If you look at the history of the past 100 or so years in this country, the first past the post is a total disaster. It's not that switching to PR would dramatically improve anything at all. Like, it wouldn't necessarily, and plenty of countries that don't have it have all kinds of problems. But first past the post is a sine qua non. It's a thing you have to get rid of if you're going to have any chance of a progressive government. It doesn't mean that getting it guarantees you a progressive government or even makes one likely. But it makes it possible. Yeah, it makes it more possible than under first past the post, which I think it just makes progressive government completely impossible. And it makes functional democracy really impossible in a multi-party system, because it's a system it's only designed to work with two parties. And I gather from the European elections, and I haven't looked at the primary data, but if there had been first past the post, Germany, Italy and France would now have much, much further to the right MEPs. Yes, I'm sure that's true. They would be 70% MEPs from the neo-fascists. So then, because it seems to me, if you get PR, we also would need somehow to change the media so that we didn't have an ultra-far-right media pushing people further and further and further to the right. We would need actually to begin to hold intelligent conversations with people about where we're going, what do we want, what is the value system behind everything that we're doing. Because the Reform guy's value system was basically dancing through the bluebells with apple pie and a nostalgia for a past that never happened, but we can all say it was lovely. Look at the countryside, isn't it beautiful? Let's keep it exactly as it is. We don't want to change anything. And he kept talking about values. It was really interesting. The Lib Dems and the Greens, they were the only people at this hustings because it was an environmental hustings, so Labour and Tories didn't bother turning up. But they were not necessarily talking about values. They were talking about policies. He was just talking about values. And if we could coalesce around values that people cared about, I think we'd stand a much better chance of actually holding conversations that didn't push people into the arms of reform. Yeah. But that's down the line. The other thing I would say, when you were asking about constitutional reform, I only really talked about proportional representation, because I think even getting rid of the Lords is probably ambitious at this stage. I think getting PR is as much as we can aim for in the near future, but much more radical types of constitutional reform are obviously what we would actually need if we were going to have a progressive solution to the political crisis. I mean, we desperately, desperately need a political leadership in this country that is willing to say, look, the whole system of liberal representative democracy, which hasn't, apart from devolution to the nations, just has not been significantly reformed since the 1920s. It's just clearly not fit for purpose in the going into the second quarter of the 21st century. But I'm afraid, there's been a handful of politicians, a handful of MPs historically have been willing to say things like that. Some of them Tories, like Douglas Carswell, and his solution to the problem would be quite different from mine. But it was kind of interesting that he was willing. Carswell, who then became a UKIP MP, who thought we should be doing everything through referendums and direct government, was at least willing to say, look, this system isn't working. Okay. Clive Lewis in the Labour Party, big advocate for PR, but is also willing to say, if you ask him, that, the whole system of... Is he still standing? They haven't purged him yet? No, he didn't get purged. He's candidate in Norwich South. But, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, I mean, he wasn't willing to say, look, parliamentary government, the whole idea of parliamentary government, it's fine as a kind of stopgap, but it's not really democracy, and it hasn't been working for decades. So I think there's a huge amount of political capital to be made out of political leaders being willing to say that, because that is the common sense view of most people in this country. Yeah. It's not something just like radical theorists and activists like us say. Like you can talk to anybody, who, even people who are not very interested in politics, and they can very easily see that this idea that how you do government is you vote for some guy who belongs to a political party every 5 years, and you sort of hope that the outcome of that is governments doing the things that you want them to do. Everybody can see that doesn't work in the 21st century. We do desperately need political leaders willing to say that isn't working and isn't going to work. But I'm afraid there is zero prospect of that emerging out of the Labour Party in the next few years.
Okay. Again, unless we can get a media system that says it loudly enough that they hear it, and it won't be the legacy media system, but perhaps we can begin to build, this would be a whole other conversation, but I have a dream of building a progressive media system. I guess David Graeber had the same dream, and that's why Novara Media exists. But we need to have different ways of getting conversations out there and getting traction. And at some level, we need to do what Steve Bannon did. And Steve Bannon gathered everyone together, and they all agreed what it was they wanted to do and how they were going to get there. The fact that Steve Bannon is really impressed with Keir Starmer terrifies me. But it's exactly as you were saying with unions. We need to all sit in a room and go, okay, what is it that we all want? They took the Libertarians and the Evangelicals, and the Evangelicals went, abortion is our bottom line. And the Libertarians, absolutely, where everybody has a choice. That's our principle. And they went, okay, you can have abortion. Okay, that's it. And so we need to sit down together with people and go, what are the three things that we are going to hammer on about every single conversation that we have with any kind of medium? And I would say constitutional change is absolutely core, because you're right. I haven't met a single human being who thinks the current system is effective and is serving them. We might disagree about how to fix it and what it would look like when fixed, but we're totally in agreement that it's not working. Final question. Do you think they're going to give votes to 16-year-olds? And would that be a useful thing to do?
I've got no idea if they're going to do it, I'm afraid. My own perspective on this, it tends to be a very popular position on the left. I have to say I'm not particularly sympathetic, because I think, well, if you're going to have an age of majority, an age of adulthood, then that's the age at which you vote. If you're going to give votes to 16-year-olds, but you're going to say that other than that, 16-year-olds are still the legal responsibility of their parents, to me, it doesn't really seem to make any sense. So, I mean, if people want to talk about actually lowering the age of citizenship, of legal citizenship, then that's fine. But for me, like, dissociating legal citizenship from the right to vote doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a broader argument around giving children and teenagers votes, and it's part of broadly reformist constitutional thinking that people will say that if you've got five humans in your household, then you should have 5 votes for that household somehow, rather than only the 2 for adults. And I think that is a credible argument. I think there's a credible argument for votes in trust for children being given to parents or whoever the legal guardians are. And I think you might well imagine a situation in which it becomes customary that when you're 16, you get to choose how your vote is cast, even if your parents don't agree with you.
Right.
But I don't think there's any logic to disentangling legal citizenship from voting rights. And for me, I mean, it risks devaluing, voting to some extent, in that, voting being one of the things you're allowed to do once you're recognised as a legal adult seems to me something that gives it a considerable amount of weight and importance. So, so I would say I don't think most of the arguments for it are very sound. And most of the arguments for it seem to me they're implicitly much bigger arguments around what it means to have a distinction between childhood and adulthood, in a complex contemporary society, and what sort of legal status you give to the existence of a sort of intermediary phase between adulthood and childhood. And I think those are all perfectly valid conversations to have. But I think those are the terms in which you have to think about it. I don't think having the policy first before you've had the broader philosophical conversation as to what actually are the principles we're trying to implement here. I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
So how do you feel about the fact that 16-year-olds can vote for the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament? Would you raise that back up to 18?
I'm not there. And so I wouldn't presume to have an opinion on it. And I'm a big believer in the idea you do have to be immersed in the culture of a place to really have opinions about its politics. Even, I do sometimes describe myself as politically Welsh, but I don't...
Wales is a lot to the left of England, but then so is Scotland. The devolved nations, all three devolved nations, I think, are way to the left of England. So yeah, that's the thing.
Yes, that's true. Yes. So
I'm not going to throw you the ideas I had in the book because I think they would make your hair stand on end. But I said that was the last question. I have another last question. This is the definite last question.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
So you said we can join a union. That would be a way of creating pressure from the left. And you're a member of the Labour Party, so we all have to say that we're going to vote Labour. I would remind people that Compass has got a vote swap system where you get to know the person you're swapping the vote with, and that potentially you could swap, say, in my constituency, I could vote Lib Dem, which stands a really good chance of getting over the line, in return for somebody voting Green in a place where one of the four Greens might get over the line. That would pull everything to the left. What is there good? If we wake up on July the 5th and Labour has got more than 100-seat majority, what can we look forward to that you think is going to work in a way that those of us who care about people and planet would be happy with?
Well, we're talking about several different things there, I think. I mean, I would say that from a purely objective perspective, if somebody is just concerned not with loyally voting Labour in every election, but wanting to see a future government pressured from the left, then the maximisation of non-Labour progressive votes would be potentially a good thing. In terms of what a government might do, a Labour government might actually do that would be positive beyond all that. Well, I think they ultimately they don't have anything like the motivation that the Tories have to persist with the policy of starving public services, starving local government, suppressing public sector pay, etc. So I'm sure we can look forward to at least some slowing down of the rate at which things are getting worse.
Oh, good. Whoop-de-doo.
I think we can probably look forward to that. I think we can expect that. It looks to me like they have made some serious proposals in some areas of policy that will improve things for people. The one thing I would point to that they have actually put in the manifesto, which looks like a serious commitment and looks like a genuinely progressive change of direction for policy in comparison to both New Labour and the Tories, is on childcare. So they've said they'll fund 100,000 nursery places, which is quite different from the pathetic 6,500 teachers in schools they've noted, which, as lots of people have noted, that's like 0.25 of a teacher per school. It's ridiculous. It's an insulting figure to have put in a manifesto.
Yeah, particularly when the schools are so underfunded. It's not just that they need teachers; they just need infrastructure and books and doors that work.
No, I know. But they have said, I can't remember now if this is in the manifesto, this is what they said the week before the manifesto was published. They have said that the way in which they will fund nursery places is by funding nurseries in local primary schools for the local community, rather than continuing to extend the private sector and through the voucher system. The childcare voucher system, which I think was brought in by New Labour. I can't remember now, actually. It may have been a late policy of the John Major government. It is the sort of thing they would have done. Or it might be a completely Blair-era innovation. If it was, they certainly had a long time to change it if they wanted to.
Yeah, they didn't overturn it, did they? It was like PFIs. They just carried on where everything left off.
No, that's right. I mean, the childcare voucher system is one of my favourite examples, and I'm trying to explain to people why neoliberal policy doesn't even work on its own terms, that it's just pure ideology. It's absolutely clear The voucher system doesn't work. The voucher system involves a huge amount of public money being spent, but that's public money is not spent entirely on childcare. A lot of it goes to the profits made by private providers.
Yeah.
The voucher system, which was a wheeze dreamed up by the far right. I mean, the libertarian right in the 1980s. They wanted everybody given vouchers to spend on private education. That's the neoliberal dream, a classic neoliberal model. But of course, the effect of it is every provider has to make a certain level of profit in order for it to be worth them carrying on. And that results routinely in what economists call market exit. That means that in any catchment area, once profits drop below a certain level, some providers will close in order to maintain a supply at sufficiently low levels for the others to make profits. So the system is engineered to produce a situation in which there's never enough supply. There's never enough childcare. It's always a struggle for parents to get childcare. Yep. And this is all subsidised through this voucher system. So it's a massive waste of public money. It's absolutely demonstrable, just in basic arithmetical terms, that it is more efficient just to have local nursery places available, provided at primary schools, as was traditional, as is the case in most countries with comparable sorts of society. And the fact that this the fact that the Labour Party has adopted that as a policy, I mean, it is pretty significant.
Okay.
It is pretty significant. It is a significant change of direction. It will make life a lot easier for a lot of parents and families.
For 100,000 anyway, how is that compared to the...
Well, if there's 100,000 places, there'll be a few hundred thousand. It means a few 100,000 children being catered for. And also, frankly, I think it's in a lot of cases it will result in a much better experience for children. They're able just to go to nursery at the primary school they're going to start at. Of course, we should not be sending children to school at age 4.
No.
Either. That's a whole other question.
Yeah, we could talk about education all day, couldn't we?
That's a mad thing that we do in this country and think it's okay. Actually, even in the States, you don't start at first grade as young as you do in this country.
But if your entire economy depends on both parents having to work in order to pay the mortgage, in order to keep the banks happy, you have to make that possible without actually killing the children. We need whole systemic change. We know this, and that's not it. But yes. But
I think this will be good. That is something to look forward to. I think that will be really, I think that would really be something to look forward to.
Okay. Anyway, Jeremy, I've kept you long enough. Thank you so much. It's so good to speak to someone who's got their finger on all the pulses and knows what's happening. And we can hope progressives have enough of a voice in the coming parliament that we can actually put pressure on a government that doesn't have many progressive instincts. Any last words for people?
No, I think you've summed it up. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you so much for your time.
You too.
Take care. We'll talk again sometime.
Bye-bye.
Well, there we go. Enormous thanks to Jeremy for taking time out of his extraordinarily busy schedule to talk to us about where we're actually at. So I hope you took away the fact that there are still things we can do. You can still join a union. There is a link in the show notes. And even if you're unemployed, self-employed or retired, you can join a union. There is room for that. And we can all put pressure, even if all we're doing is voting in the leadership elections. Beyond this, I've put a link to the Compass Winners One vote swapping site, which does seem to me to be one of the more targeted tactical voting options. They will help connect you to somebody that you can actually speak to. And so, for instance, I would like to vote Green. In my constituency, there is genuinely no point. It would be registered potentially as a vote, but I don't think anyone's going to take any notice of it. But if I can connect with somebody, say, in the neighbouring constituency of North Hereford, where the Green does stand a good chance, and I can vote for the Lib Dem here, who also stands a good chance, and someone who would like to vote Lib Dem can vote Green in any of the constituencies where it actually works, then we've done something useful. Elections in this country, because of the first-past-the-post system, often turn on a few hundred votes in any given constituency. If you have read the book, you will understand this in more depth. But every vote actually counts, and every person we can get into the House of Commons who is a decent human being who actually understands that we need constitutional change, who understands about the meta crisis and the biophysical risks. Every single one of those is going to count. So, I've never done this vote swapping before. I don't, to be honest, know exactly how it works. It seems useful to me. If you think it's not and you've got a better idea, then please go for it. But whatever you do, please get involved. Staying out of politics is now a political statement that you like the status quo. And if you're listening to this podcast, I struggle to think that this is the case. There are things we can do, and all of them require that we're making phone calls or talking to people, delivering leaflets, doing whatever we can to get the right people over the line. So go to it. We will be back with our actual scheduled podcast in a couple of days. And in the meantime, thanks to Cara C for the music at the head and foot, to Alan Lawes of Airtight Studios for the production, to Anne Thomas for the transcripts, to Faith Tillery for all of the work behind the scenes, and, as ever, an enormous thanks to you for listening. Let's make whatever change we can. See you next time. Thank you, and goodbye.